The world for Captain Eva Rostova often shrank to the dimensions of her cockpit. It was a pressurized womb of acrylic glass and cold metal suspended 5,000 feet above a land that had forgotten peace. Below, the Zagros mountain range unfolded in a palette of dust brown and shadow purple, a geography of hostility. The sun, a merciless white disk in the steel-gray sky, baked the landscape and glittered off the fuselage of her A-10 Thunderbolt II. They called it the Warthog. An ugly name for an ugly job. The aircraft was not built for elegance or speed. It was a flying tank, a brutalist masterpiece of engineering designed around a single monstrous weapon, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barreled cannon that spat 30mm depleted uranium shells at a rate that defied comprehension. It was a sound that ground troops called God's own burp, a sound that meant help had arrived. Eva's call sign was Valkyrie, a name chosen for her by the squadron's previous commander, a man with a flair for the dramatic. She'd never liked it. The Valkyries of myth chose the slain for Valhalla. Her job was to prevent men from being slain in the first place. The irony was a constant low-level hum beneath the engine's whine. Her gloved fingers danced over the control panel, a familiar choreography of flicks and touches. Fuel levels check. Hydraulic pressure check. Armament systems green. Everything was nominal. But nothing about her presence here felt normal. In a squadron of 20 pilots, she was one of 2 women, the only one flying the A-10. She didn't face overt hostility. The professionalism of the service mostly forbade it, but she felt the subtle friction of being an anomaly. The extra glance in the briefing room, the half-second of hesitation before a shared joke, the quiet condescension of older pilots who thought the Warthog's cockpit was no place for a woman's delicate touch. She proved them wrong with every sortie. Her flying was fluid, her gun runs precise. She treated the 30-ton aircraft not as a blunt instrument, but as a surgeon's scalpel. She knew its moods, the way it shuddered in a steep dive, the groan of the airframe as it pulled high Gs. The Warthog was an extension of her will. Valkyrie 1-1, this is broadsword. The voice of the Air Support Operations Center crackled in her headset, pulling her from her thoughts. We have a tasking. Stand by for coordinates. Eva's posture straightened. Her gaze sharpened, scanning the desolate terrain below. This was the moment the quiet contemplation ended, and the immense weight of her role descended. Down there, somewhere in that maze of rocks and ravines, were soldiers. Men whose faces she would never see, whose names she would never know, but whose lives for the next few hours were entirely in her hands. She was their unseen guardian, a distant angel of death sworn to their protection. She keyed the mic, her voice calm, and even betraying none of the cold tension coiling in her gut. Broadsword Valkyrie, standing by. The coordinates appeared on her main display, a blinking green cursor in a sea of brown topography. A reconnaissance team, a sniper overwatch unit, had spotted enemy movement near a contested ridgeline. Her job was simple: to fly a holding pattern, to be a presence, a threat looming in the sky to deter any attack. And if deterrence failed, to become something else entirely. She banked the Warthog gently, the horizon tilting in her canopy. The gray sky, the brown earth, the silent promise of violence. This was her world. She was the guardian, and her vigil had begun. The green cursor on her display designated the operational area, a jagged stretch of ridgeline known as Objective Serpent's Tooth. Eva eased the Warthog into a wide, lazy orbit, a circling hawk of painted steel. From this altitude, the ground was an abstraction, a topographical map come to life. The soldiers she was sent to protect were invisible, their existence confirmed only by a digital marker and the crackle of encrypted radio transmissions. They were a concept, a responsibility not yet human. She flew for 20 minutes in disciplined silence, her eyes methodically scanning the terrain through the target acquisition pod's display, cross-referencing the feed with the satellite imagery on her kneeboard. It was a sterile, detached form of watchfulness. She saw heat signatures from sun-baked rocks, the occasional flicker of a herd of goats moving across a slope, but nothing that matched the enemy profile. Patience was a weapon system like any other. Then a new voice broke the silence. It was not the clipped, impersonal tone of the command center at Broadsword. This transmission was direct ground-to-air with the faint hiss of a field radio. "Now Valkyrie 1-1, this is Nomad 1. Radio check over." Eva's thumb pressed the transmit button on her control stick. "Nomad 1 Valkyrie. I read you 5x5. I have you in sight." This was a slight lie. She had their location in sight. The men themselves were perfectly camouflaged specks if they could be seen at all. "Solid copy, Valkyrie," the voice replied. There was a quality to it that stood out from the usual frantic battlefield chatter. It was a baritone, steady and unhurried, each word delivered with an economy of effort that suggested absolute confidence. There was no tremor of fear, no edge of adrenaline. It was the voice of a man who was completely at home in this lethal environment. "We have eyes on 3 individuals setting up a DSHK emplacement. They're dug in on the reverse slope of the primary ridge coordinates to follow." A data packet arrived instantly, painting a precise red diamond on her tactical map. Eva nudged the Warthog's nose down, and the world in her targeting pod zoomed in with sickening clarity. The infrared display resolved the image, 3 distinct human shapes glowing with body heat clustered around the dark, cold metal of a heavy machine gun. They were less than 800 meters from Nomad's position. "I have PID." Eva confirmed the acronym for positive identification rolling off her tongue. "I see 3 tangos, 1 heavy weapon. What is your intent, Nomad?" "They haven't spotted us yet." The voice of Nomad 1 returned. "We'd prefer to remain ghosts. Request a non-kinetic pass. Show of force. Let's see if we can convince them to find a new line of work." It was a smart request. A loud, low pass from an A-10 was often enough to break the morale of undisciplined fighters. It conserved ammunition and avoided the messy complications of a confirmed kill. It required precision flying. "Need copy, Nomad. Commencing show of force run from the southeast." Eva broke her orbit. She rolled the Warthog onto its side, pulling the stick back into a controlled dive. The ground rushed up to meet her. The hum of the twin engines deepened into a savage roar. The abstract map below resolved into individual boulders, thorny bushes, and the texture of the dirt itself. Her systems screamed warnings about altitude, but she ignored them, her focus absolute. She flew directly over the enemy position at less than 300 feet. The sheer shockwave of her passage would have been a physical blow. She could imagine the scene on the ground, the sudden deafening shriek of the engines, the monstrous shadow of the Warthog blotting out the sun for a terrifying second. It was psychological warfare in its purest form. As she pulled up the G-force, pressing her deep into her seat, she rolled the aircraft to get a view of the target area. The result was immediate. The 3 heat signatures were no longer clustered. They were sprinting in opposite directions, abandoning the heavy weapon in their panic. She stabilized her flight path, her breathing steady. The voice returned to her ear as calm as before. "Excellent effect, Valkyrie. Target is neutralized. They're running for the hills." There was a pause, just a beat. "Clean flying." "Happy to oblige, Nomad," Eva replied, her tone matching his professionalism. "Valkyrie is RTB unless otherwise tasked." "Negative. Stick around for a few if you can. We appreciate the company." The request was unusual, but she understood the sentiment. Her presence overhead kept the ghosts at bay. "Roger that, Nomad 1, she said. "I'm your guardian angel." A faint click on the radio was the only acknowledgement. The voice of Sergeant Lars Jensen, though she did not yet know his name, fell silent. But the connection remained. For the first time, a soldier on the ground had become more than a marker on a map. He was a steady voice, a calm mind, a partner. She resumed her high orbit, the quiet of the cockpit, feeling a little less lonely than before. The air in the debriefing room was recycled and cold, smelling faintly of stale coffee and ozone from the humming servers. Eva sat at the polished wood table, her flight suit feeling stiff and restrictive now that she was back on the ground. Across from her, Major Davies stood with his arms crossed, a picture of rigid authority. He was a man carved from sharp angles, his jaw tight, his gaze as penetrating and unsparing as a searchlight. War for Major Davies was a problem of logistics and attrition. You applied overwhelming force to a target, you removed it from the board, and you moved on. Empathy was a rounding error. He was not reviewing her successful mission with Nomad team. Instead, he had cued the gun camera footage from a sortie 2 days prior. On the large screen at the front of the room, a grainy infrared world played out in stark black and white. A technical pickup truck glowing hot against the cool desert floor was racing down a dirt track. A-10 Captain Rostova. Davies began, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. "Walk us through this." The target was a suspected VBIED, vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. Intel flagged it as high priority. You had it. Eva kept her eyes on the screen, her own memory of the event far more vivid than the monochromatic footage. "I acquired the target at 14:32 hours. She stated, her tone a perfect model of military brevity. "I established a lock-confirmed positive identification based on vehicle type and its known trajectory towards a friendly convoy's route. I was cleared hot for engagement." On the screen, the crosshairs of the targeting pod settled firmly on the truck. A box formed around it. The word "armed" flashed in the corner of the display. In the room, the other pilots watched in silence, their faces impassive. They knew what this was. This wasn't a debrief. It was a dissection. And yet. Davies continued, his voice dropping slightly. "You did not release the weapon. The footage shows you tracked for another 22 seconds before the vehicle found cover in a small wadi. Explain your reasoning, Captain." The truck on the screen suddenly swerved, kicking up a plume of dust, and skidded to a halt beside a small square compound. The building was little more than a mud brick hut with a makeshift animal pen, but the thermal imaging showed the unmistakable smaller signatures of what looked like a family. 2 adults, 3 children huddled near the entrance, startled by the vehicle's arrival. Major, as the truck approached the structure, I identified non-combatant thermal signatures within the weapon's designated fragmentation radius. Eva explained, her voice steady. "My assessment was that the structure was an occupied civilian dwelling. Engaging the target would have resulted in an unacceptable risk of collateral damage in direct violation of ROE Section 4, Paragraph 2. Davies let out a short, humorless laugh. ROE Section 4. Yes, the section written by lawyers in air-conditioned offices 10,000 miles from here. Did you consider, Captain, that this dwelling was in fact a sympathizer's safe house? That the enemy deliberately uses these locations as shields? Because they know pilots like you will hesitate. So, I considered that possibility, Major. And what was your conclusion?" My conclusion was that I could not be certain," Eva said, meeting his gaze. "And my job is not to kill on a possibility. My job is to be absolutely certain. The price of being wrong was 5 civilian lives. Davies stepped closer to the table, leaning forward on his knuckles. His voice lowered to a confidential, cutting whisper. The price of your hesitation, Captain, is that a truck full of explosives potentially reached its target, or lives to fight another day. War isn't clean. It requires a certain clarity of purpose. You are here to remove threats to our soldiers on the ground. That is your only mission. The silence in the room was heavy. Eva felt the gazes of her squadron mates, some sympathetic, some carefully neutral. They all flew under Davies' command, and they knew the path of least resistance. She had just chosen to walk a different one. With respect, Major, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I believe my mission is to protect our soldiers without sacrificing the very principles we're here to defend. Turning a farm into a crater is not a victory. It's a recruitment poster for the enemy. Davies stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold. The ideological chasm between them had been laid bare for all to see. He saw a weapon that had refused to fire. She saw a moment where humanity had to override the machine. Finally, he straightened up. Debrief concluded. He snapped, turning his back on her. Dismissed. Eva rose, gathered her helmet, and walked out of the room. She didn't look at the other pilots. She didn't need to. She could feel the wall of their silence and the distinct chill of her commander's doubt, which now clung to her like the desert dust. 2 days after her confrontation with Major Davies, Eva found herself in the main Tactical Operations Center, a cavernous, dimly lit room where the entire war was reduced to glowing icons on a dozen oversized screens. The air hummed with the quiet efficiency of professionals at work. Here, the squabbles of a single squadron felt petty. This was the nerve center where strategy was born. An intelligence officer, a crisp Air Force captain with tired eyes, stood at a podium, his voice a dry monotone, as he detailed a recent spike in coordinated attacks. What we're seeing is a paradigm shift, he said, gesturing to a map that was bleeding with red icons. The opposition's tactics have become more sophisticated. IEDs are better concealed, ambushes are more complex, and they're targeting local infrastructure and pro-government leaders with surgical precision. This isn't random insurgency anymore. This is orchestrated. Eva listened intently, her gaze fixed on the map. The red icons formed a web, a pattern of violence that was spreading, strangling the region. Until recently, the officer continued, we've been unable to identify the command and control element behind this new wave. That changed 48 hours ago. He clicked a button, and a new slide appeared. It showed a photo of a rugged, inhospitable mountain pass. The breakthrough came from one of our deep cover LRS team's long-range surveillance. For the past 3 weeks, call sign Nomad has been operating in the Tangi Valley, observing and listening. At the mention of the call sign, Eva felt a subtle shift in her focus. Nomad. The calm voice on the radio. The unseen soldiers she had watched over. While she had been arguing philosophy with Davies, they had been on the ground hunting. So the Nomad team was able to intercept a series of communications and, at great personal risk, acquire photographic evidence. The screen changed again. This time it showed a grainy, long-distance photograph of a man. He was lean, bearded, his face half wrapped in a checkered shema, but his eyes were visible, and they were dark and intense. We don't have a given name, the intelligence officer said. But in the chatter he's referred to with a consistent moniker Al-Sayir. The locals translate it as the Ghost. We believe he is the architect of this new campaign. A low murmur went through the room. A face had been put to the chaos. His methodology is what concerns us most. The officer added, his tone grim. He is exceptionally skilled at embedding his operations within civilian populations. He stores weapons in schools, plans attacks from mosques, and has shown a consistent and callous willingness to use non-combatants as human shields. His strategy appears to be twofold: inflict maximum damage on our forces, while simultaneously provoking a response that will cause civilian casualties, which he then exploits for propaganda. Eva felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This was her dilemma from the debriefing room, personified and elevated to the level of grand strategy. The Ghost was actively trying to create the very no-win scenarios that Davies accused her of failing to navigate. He was baiting them. He was baiting her. The base commander, a full-bird colonel with a weathered face and a quiet air of command, stepped forward. The Ghost is no longer just a target, he announced, his voice filling the room. He is the target. His capture or elimination is now priority one for all assets in this theater of operations. This is a manhunt. The briefing continued, outlining new operational parameters and intelligence-gathering efforts. But Eva's mind was elsewhere. The war had just become intensely personal. Every decision she made in the cockpit would now be framed by the hunt for this man. Every suspicious vehicle, every compound, every shadow on the ground could be his. And his signature tactic was to wrap himself in the cloak of the innocent, daring her to make the wrong choice, to fire the shot that would serve his cause. She looked again at the blurry image of the Ghost on the screen. Then she thought of the voice of Nomad, one calm, precise professional. He and his team were the ones walking through the Ghost's hunting grounds. They were the ones risking everything to find him. And she, in her cockpit, thousands of feet above, was their only immediate lifeline. The connection she had felt was no longer just a professional courtesy. It was a critical link in the chain that would tighten around this new deadly enemy. Her vigil, she knew, was about to become far more demanding. The hunt for the Ghost had tightened the operational tempo to a suffocating degree. Every shadow was a potential threat, every piece of intelligence a frantic race against time. Eva found herself in the air more than on the ground, the cockpit of the Warthog becoming more familiar than her own quarters. Today's mission was a prime example, a target of opportunity. A crumbling, isolated workshop at the edge of a village that intelligence suggested was a key munitions transfer point for the Ghost's network. Major Davies was patched into the command channel from the toque, his voice a persistent, grating presence in her helmet. "Intel on this is solid, Valkyrie," he stated, forgoing the usual protocols. "This isn't a drill. We need a win. Do not let this one walk." Eva didn't respond. She simply banked the A-10, her eyes scrutinizing the target through the pod's camera. The workshop was a simple mud brick structure with a collapsed roof on one side. It appeared derelict. Her infrared scan showed no heat signatures inside. The building was as cold as the surrounding rocks. All visible signs pointed to an empty shell. Yet the orders were clear. The ground patrol waiting 2 kilometers away needed the site sanitized before they would approach. "I have the target in sight," she reported, her voice betraying none of her apprehension. "No signs of life. I am commencing a strafing run from the west. Gun attack." She chose the cannon over a bomb. It was more precise, the cone of destruction, more controllable. It was a choice born of caution, a reflex after her last debrief with Davies. "Copy, Valkyrie." Davies' voice crackled. "You are cleared hot. Prosecute the target." Eva pushed the nose of the Warthog down. The earth swelled in her canopy, the muted browns and grays of the landscape sharpening into focus. The workshop grew from a square on her map to a tangible building. Her instruments chirped their consent. The targeting reticle, a green circle of death, contracted around the structure. Her thumb hovered over the red button on her control stick, the trigger for the Avenger cannon. The hydraulic whine of the gun rotating into position was a familiar visceral sound. 5 seconds to release. The world slowed. Her breathing was a controlled rhythm. 3 seconds. Her finger tightened, taking up the slack in the trigger. 1 second. A flicker of movement. At the absolute edge of her vision from a blind spot behind the workshop, a small shape darted into the open. It wasn't a fighter. It wasn't a soldier. The pod's high-definition camera resolved the image with brutal clarity, a little girl no older than 8, her dress a splash of bright yellow against the dull earth. She was chasing a runaway goat, her laughter silent to Eva, but visible in the joyful abandon of her movements. She was running directly into the path of the cannon's fire. Time snapped back into motion. Instinct faster than thought, faster than orders took over. Eva didn't fire. She wrenched the control stick back and to the right, a violent, desperate maneuver. The 30-ton aircraft committed to its attack dive protested with a groaning shudder. The engines screamed as she demanded everything they had. A crushing G-force slammed her into her seat, stealing her breath and blurring her vision. "Abort, abort, abort!" She yelled into the mic, her voice strained. "Civilian in the kill box, I repeat, non-combatant child is on the target." The response from Davies was instantaneous, laced with fury. "Valkyrie, what are you doing? My feed is clear, I see nothing." My camera has it, Major," she shot back, fighting to level the plane. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A girl. She came from behind the building. The target is fouled. I will not engage. Rostova, damn it, you are letting shadows play tricks on you. That is a confirmed hostile location. Get back around and hit it now. Negative. Eva said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. I have a positive visual on a child. I will not fire. She forced the Warthog back into a high orbit, her hands trembling slightly, the only outward sign of the adrenaline coursing through her. On her screen, she watched the little girl finally catch the goat by its rope, completely unaware that she had just run through the crosshairs of a weapon that could have vaporized her. The girl led the animal back behind the workshop and disappeared. The opportunity was gone. The element of surprise was lost. Any munitions in that building would be gone within minutes. The flight back to base was conducted in absolute radio silence. The subsequent debriefing was not loud. It was worse. It was cold, formal, and utterly damning. In front of the entire squadron, Major Davies officially logged the incident. Captain Rostova E. refused direct order to engage a valid high-priority target. Cited unconfirmed visual of a non-combatant. He didn't need to say more. The black mark on her permanent record was as real and as damaging as a physical blow. That night alone in her room, Eva replayed the gun camera footage on her tablet over and over. She zoomed in on the fleeting, grainy image of the girl in the yellow dress. A ghost, a shadow, a life. A razor-thin line that she had refused to cross even as her commander was pushing her over the edge. The reprimand had left a chill that clung to Eva long after the desert heat returned. She flew with a new weight on her shoulders, a constant nagging voice of self-doubt that whispered alongside the hum of the engines. Every decision felt scrutinized, every shadow on the ground. A potential trap not just for her, but for her career. She was on a routine patrol over a quiet sector when the call came, and the quiet shattered. It wasn't a calm request. It was a chaotic burst of shouting over the command channel relayed from the TOC. All assets, all assets. We have a TIC troops in contact, call sign Nomad, is ambushed in the Gar Canyon. Pinned down, taking heavy casualties. Eva's blood ran cold. Nomad. The Gar Canyon was a notoriously treacherous gash in the earth, a kill box for anyone caught in the open. She immediately banked the Warthog, pushing the throttles forward. Broadsword, this is Valkyrie 1-1. I am the closest asset. En route. ETA 4 minutes. The canyon was worse than she imagined. A low, ragged ceiling of clouds forced her to fly at a dangerously low altitude, the granite walls feeling close enough to touch. Below, the battle was laid out with horrific clarity. Lars's team, maybe 6 men she couldn't be sure, were pinned behind a cluster of boulders at the canyon's narrowest point. Muzzle flashes winked from enemy positions dug into the cliffs directly above them. It was a perfect ambush. The Valkyrie, be advised, the ceiling is too low for a standard ordnance drop. Davy's voice cut in sharp and cautionary. You can't get the proper angle. Hold your position and wait for the Apache gunships. They don't have 15 minutes, Major. Eva countered, her eyes tracing the paths of the tracer rounds. Then, through the cacophony, a familiar voice, impossibly calm. Valkyrie Nomad 1. Glad you could make it to the party. Eva let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Nomad 1, I'm here. Talk to me. What do you need? I need you to thread a needle. Lars said, his voice strained, but steady, the sound of his rifle firing punctuating his words. The primary machine gun nest is on the eastern wall directly above our position. I'm painting it with my laser now. A sparkling green dot appeared on the cliffside, terrifyingly close to the friendly position indicators on her screen. It was less than 50 meters away from them. One Nomad, that's danger close. Eva said, her own voice tight. The official minimum safe distance for a 30mm cannon run was 4 times that. I can't guarantee placement. The fragmentation could hit your position. There was a pause filled with the roar of gunfire. We are already taking casualties, Valkyrie. Lars said, his calm finally cracking for a fraction of a second. We won't last another 10 minutes. We trust your hand. Just put it on the laser. This was it. The ultimate test. Not of regulations or procedures, but of pure trust. He was trusting her not to kill him. She had to trust his eyes, his judgment. The thought of Davies, of the reprimand, vanished. All that mattered was the voice in her ear and the men under fire. All right, Nomad. I'm coming in from the north. Talk me onto it. Roger, I see you, Lars said. The cloud cover is thick. Watch the western wall on your approach. It juts out more than it looks on the map. She dove into the canyon. The Warthog bucked in the turbulent air. Her proximity alarms blared a frantic, high-pitched scream. She ignored them. Her world narrowed to the sliver of rock face visible through her heads-up display and Lars's voice. Chuck, steady. He said, his words a lifeline. See the dark water stain that looks like a serpent. The target is 20 feet to the right of its head, just under the rock shelf. She saw it, a tiny cave spitting fire. She had less than 3 seconds to acquire fire and pull out before she became a part of the canyon wall herself. Visual, she grunted, fighting the controls. Send it, Lars commanded. Her thumb depressed the trigger. The world erupted in the Warthog's iconic roar. BRRRRRT! A stream of incandescent shells, a river of tungsten and fire slammed into the cliff face. For one terrifying eternal second, Eva saw nothing but granite and smoke as she yanked the stick back, the A-10 clawing for sky, its wingtips seeming to skim the rock. The alarms fell silent as she cleared the ridge. A profound silence followed on the radio. Her heart pounded in her throat. Did she get it? Did she miss? Did she kill them all? Then Lars's voice, breathless and raw. Good. Hits. On target. Valkyrie. Direct hit. The firing has stopped. He took a ragged breath. You have no idea. You just saved us all. Nomad won out. Eva leveled her wings, flying back into the gray anonymity of the clouds. The tremor in her hands was gone. The chill of her commander's doubt had been burned away by the heat of the gun run. She hadn't just destroyed a target. She had validated a bond, a sacred trust, forged at 50 meters in the heart of a storm of steel. Her purpose had never been clearer. Sleep did not come easily. In the sterile quiet of her small room, with the air conditioner humming a monotonous tune, the echoes of the battle were louder than they had been in the sky. Adrenaline is a temporary shield. When it recedes, it leaves the nerves exposed and raw. The frantic alarms of the proximity sensors, the gut-wrenching G-forces, the blinding flash of her own cannon fire. These things settled deep in her bones, a physical memory of the razor's edge she had danced upon. Eva threw off the thin blanket and swung her legs over the side of the cot. The concrete floor was cold under her bare feet. The base was in its deepest state of quiet, the hours just before dawn, when even a war zone seems to hold its breath. But for her, there was no peace. The weight of her decisions, of the lives held in the balance of her thumb on a trigger, was a physical presence in the room. She moved to the small metal desk that served as her entire personal space. She powered on her ruggedized laptop, the glow of the screen pushing back the shadows. This had become a ritual on nights like this, a private obsessive pilgrimage through the digital ghosts of her missions. She inserted the data card from her flight helmet, the information from the Canyon sortie uploading with a quiet series of clicks. First, she listened to the audio. She isolated the tactical channel, filtering out the noise from the talkie, focusing only on the voices from the ground. She heard the initial panicked shouts of the ambush, the crackle of small arms fire, the desperate calls for a medic. Then cutting through it all came Lars Jensen's voice. She listened to his words, "We trust your hand," over and over, the phrase becoming a mantra in the silent room. It was a declaration of faith that felt heavier than any command. It was the sound of a man handing her his life and the lives of his men with a calm that defied the hell he was in. Next, she watched. The gun camera footage was a brutal, nauseating ballet of physics and violence. She saw the world tilt and plummet as she dove into the canyon. She saw the angry red text of the altitude warnings flash across the screen. She saw the brief, sparkling glint of Lars's laser on the rock, a tiny beacon in a world of chaos. She paused the video a single frame before the first 30mm shell impacted. The image was a study in contrasts, the organic, ancient granite of the cliffside and the cold, geometric perfection of her targeting reticle. She had unleashed a storm of manufactured death into that place, and she had to force herself to remember that it was an act of salvation. Her ritual expanded. She pulled up the strategic maps of the Zargos region, her operational area. She cross-referenced the grids with the day's ground unit movement logs. Call signs floated across the screen: Paladin, Ghost Rider, Warhorse, Nomad. To Major Davies, they were chess pieces. To Eva, they were becoming something more. She traced their routes with her finger, imagining their journey through the treacherous valleys and over the exposed ridgelines she only ever saw from above. She tried to bridge the impossible distance between her sterile cockpit and their dusty, blood-soaked reality. Driven by a need she didn't fully understand, she opened the military's internal network and ran a search for the roster of the team designated Nomad. Most of the information was classified, their photographs redacted black boxes for security reasons. but some data was there. Service records, commendations, places of birth. Lars Jensen Sergeant, decorated for valor, enlisted 10 years ago, from a small, unpronounceable town in rural Denmark. That was it. But it was something. It was a route, a connection to a world outside this war. She stared at the black box where his face should be, trying to construct it from the sound of his voice. Was he tall or short, fair-haired like most Danes? Did his eyes hold the same calm as his voice? Did he have a family waiting for him in that small town? The act of imagining him, of giving him a life beyond the radio, was both a comfort and a profound burden. It made him real, and in doing so made the responsibility of protecting him almost unbearable. The first hint of dawn was beginning to soften the edges of the window frame when she finally closed the laptop. She hadn't slept. An exhausted, hollow ache settled behind her eyes. The faces she had imagined, the anonymous soldiers she had tried to give form, lingered in her mind. The title Guardian was no mythic call sign. It was a vow. And with every flight, every sleepless night spent with their digital ghosts, she was beginning to understand the price it demanded. The victory in the Gar Canyon was short-lived. In war, momentum is a fickle ally. While Eva's bond with Nomad team had solidified into something unbreakable, her relationship with Major Davies had devolved into a cold, professional truce. He couldn't fault her successful mission, but he watched her with the wary eye of a man who had lost control of a valuable weapon. Eva was on strip alert, sitting fully strapped into the cockpit of her Warthog at the end of the runway. The sun beat down on the canopy, turning the small space into a greenhouse. It was a high-tension form of waiting, the aircraft's systems humming, ready to launch at a moment's notice. For 2 hours, the only sound was the crackle of the radio and the whine of the auxiliary power unit. Then the call came. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Warhorse 2-5. We are ambushed in the Al-Qadir marketplace. Taking heavy fire from multiple directions, we are pinned down." The voice was young, panicked. Warhorse was a regular infantry platoon, not a battle-hardened special forces unit like Nomad. Eva's hand instinctively went to the throttle. "Broadsword Valkyrie 1-1 is on alert status, ready to launch." "Stand by, Valkyrie," the controller's voice replied, followed immediately by the sharp, authoritative tone of Major Davies, who had clearly taken direct control of the incident in the TOC. "Warhorse 2-5, this is Broadsword Command. Give me a situation report. What are the enemy's positions? Are civilians present?" "Sir, they're everywhere. On the rooftops, in the alleyways. The market is full of civilians. They're running, screaming. We can't get a clear shot. We need you to suppress the rooftops on the north side of the square now." Eva listened, her frustration mounting with every passing second. Her engines were spooled. The coordinates were already on her display. She was 5 minutes away from saving those men. "I will not authorize a strike on an active marketplace." Warhorse Davies' voice was stern by the book. "The potential for collateral damage is too high. You need to provide positive identification of hostile targets in a clear field of fire. Do you understand?" "Major, we don't have time to paint a damn picture." The soldier on the ground screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. The sound of an explosion drowned him out for a second. "We are taking casualties. We need help now." Eva keyed her mic, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Broadsword Valkyrie, let me get airborne. A low-altitude, high-speed pass might be enough to scatter the enemy. A show of force. No weapons released." "Negative, Valkyrie. Remain on the ground," Davies commanded. "This is my chessboard. I need absolute clarity before I move a piece." The irony was so bitter, it tasted like acid. The very man who had lambasted her for her caution was now paralyzed by it demanding an impossible standard of certainty from men who were actively dying. She gripped the control stick, a wave of impotent fury washing over her. She was a guardian grounded, a weapon safetied. For 3 agonizing minutes, an eternity in a firefight, Davies continued to demand information that the soldiers of Warhorse Platoon were in no position to give. Finally, a different voice came from the ground, this one older, calmer, but laced with grief. "Broadsword, this is Warhorse Actual. We are disengaging, pulling back to the west. The contact has broken." Only then did Davies give the order. "Valkyrie, you are cleared for takeoff. Scramble. Fly overwatch for Warhorse's withdrawal." Eva launched the Warthog with a vengeance, pushing the engines to their limit. She arrived on station less than 5 minutes later, but it was already over. The marketplace was a chaotic scene of smoke, overturned stalls, and fleeing civilians. She saw the soldiers of Warhorse Platoon dragging their wounded comrades into the back of an armored vehicle. The enemy fighters, the Ghost's disciples, had vanished back into the civilian population as if they were never there. She had arrived just in time to watch the aftermath. The leader of Warhorse Platoon came back on the radio, his voice hollowed out by loss. "Broadsword Warhorse, we are moving. Be advised. We have 2 KIA-4 WIA." He paused, and the accusation in his silence was deafening. Air support was not on station. Eva circled helplessly above the immense power of her aircraft, utterly useless. She felt a profound, sickening guilt. It was not her finger that had hesitated, but she was part of the system that had failed. Davies, in his rigid demand for a perfect war, had created the very conditions for defeat. She had saved Nomad by trusting her gut and bending the rules. By following the orders of her commander to the letter, she had just become a spectator to a tragedy. In the days following the Warhorse incident, a mechanical coldness settled over Eva. She performed her duties with flawless precision, but the spirit, the intuitive connection she felt with her aircraft and her mission was gone. She was an automaton executing a program. Her flight patterns were perfect. Her radio calls were clipped and efficient, but she was a ghost in her own machine. The guilt she carried was a silent, heavy passenger in the cockpit. She was flying a high-altitude overwatch mission for Nomad team. They were tracking a suspected courier for the Ghost through a series of remote, interconnected valleys. It was a slow, methodical mission of observation. No shots fired, no imminent threats. Just hours of watching and waiting, a task that gave Eva far too much time to think, to replay the desperate, unanswered calls from the marketplace. Down below, Lars Jensen moved with his team, his senses attuned to the landscape around him and the subtle frequencies in his earpiece. He had heard the after-action reports about the Warhorse ambush. He knew the official story, a complex engagement where air support was delayed pending target verification. But Lars was a student of the nuances of war, and he knew the real story was always in what wasn't said. And he could hear the unsaid things in Valkyrie's voice. The calm, steady presence that had talked him through a hellstorm in the Gar Canyon was gone, replaced by a brittle, disembodied professionalism. As his team settled into a concealed position to observe the courier's route, Lars took a knee and keyed his radio. "Valkyrie Nomad 1. We are static for the foreseeable. All quiet. Do copy, Nomad." Eva's voice came back instantly, flat and distant. "I'm holding a standard figure 8 pattern. Call when you need me." The silence stretched. Lars listened to the faint, steady hiss of the open channel, a sound he had come to associate with her presence. He knew he was crossing a professional boundary, but the instinct to do so was overwhelming. "Heard about the action in Al-Qadir a few days ago," he said, his tone casual, observational. "Tough break for those guys." There was a noticeable pause before her reply. It was a complicated situation. She said, her voice guarded a stone wall of military jargon. Lars knew then that platitudes would be an insult. She wasn't looking for excuses or sympathy. He thought of the faces of his own men currently cleaning their rifles and eating ration bars around him. He thought of the moment in the canyon when he had stared death in the face and placed his faith in her hand. He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more personal, meant only for her and not for the official record. Die Valkyrie. He began letting the call sign hang in the air for a moment. Listen to me. My medic, Corporal Eriksson, is sitting right here cleaning his kit. The only reason he's not in a body bag is because you flew through a rock garden to take out that gunner. Our point man, Sergeant Petrova, is going to see his kid's 5th birthday next month. That's on you. He stopped, letting the words sink in. He didn't mention Davies or the rules of engagement or the soldiers who were lost. He spoke only of the tangible, undeniable good she had put into the world. He was reminding her of her power not as an instrument of a flawed command structure, but as a guardian. In the cockpit 5 miles above the earth, Eva closed her eyes. His words bypassed her defenses and went straight to the heart of her guilt. She saw not the smoking marketplace, but the grateful faces of the men she imagined in Nomad team. Lars's voice, calm and certain, was a tether pulling her back from the abyss of self-recrimination. He was offering her not an absolution she couldn't accept, but a truth she couldn't deny. A long moment passed, filled only by the sound of her own breathing. When she finally keyed the microphone, her voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't conceal. Solid copy, Nomad 1. It was all she said. It was all she needed to say. It was acceptance. It was gratitude. It was a promise. As she opened her eyes and looked out at the vast sunlit horizon, the sky no longer felt like a lonely, crushing void. It was her domain once more. Lars's words had been a lifeline, pulling Eva back from the brink of professional apathy. Her focus returned with a vengeance sharper and more resolute than before. She understood now that her role was not just to follow orders, but to be the final thinking link in a chain of survival. This new clarity was tested less than a week later when the biggest intelligence breakthrough in the hunt for the ghost finally came. The atmosphere in the TOC was electric. A trusted high-level informant cultivated for months had delivered the jackpot. The ghost was scheduled to meet with several subordinate cell leaders in a remote village called Kala Isar, nestled deep in a mountain basin. The intelligence was corroborated by a faint signal intercept. It was the most concrete location they had ever had. A complex snatch-and-grab operation was considered and dismissed as too risky. Instead, the colonel opted for a stealthier approach. "We need positive ID before we level a village." He'd set his eyes scanning the faces of his command staff. "This is a job for a scalpel, not a sledgehammer." The scalpel was Nomad team. They were tasked with a covert night insertion to establish an observation post, confirm the ghost's presence with high-resolution photography, and then slip away. Eva was assigned as their dedicated close air support. Major Davies had argued for a 2-ship flight of F-16s, citing their speed and heavier payload, but the colonel had overruled him. "Nomad works best with Valkyrie," he'd stated flatly. "Their rhythm is proven. She flies." Eva felt a cold prickle of unease as she studied the mission profile. It was too perfect. The ghost, a master of misdirection and paranoia, suddenly appearing at a prearranged meeting. It felt like a violation of his character. She spent hours examining the satellite imagery of Kala Isar. The village sat in a natural bowl overlooked by craggy ridges on 3 sides. It was a defender's dream, an attacker's nightmare, a natural kill box. The ingress and egress routes are too predictable, she remarked to one of the mission planners. There's only one viable helicopter landing zone, and the overwatch positions are obvious. The informant's intel is rated A1 Captain, the planner replied dismissively. The ghost thinks he's safe out there. That's why he's getting sloppy. Eva wasn't convinced, but she kept her reservations to herself. Her job wasn't to question the intel. It was to protect the men sent to act on it. Hours later, she was in the air, the world below, a featureless black ocean under a moonless sky. She watched the faint heat signature of the Black Hawk helicopter carrying Nomad team as it swept low through the mountains, finally settling in the designated LZ. She saw the 6 tiny, glowing shapes of the soldiers disembark and melt into the landscape. For the next hour, she maintained a wide, silent orbit, listening to the quiet, coded transmissions as Lars led his team into position on a ridge overlooking the sleeping village. All was quiet, too quiet. From his vantage point, Lars scanned the village through his thermal scope. The target building, a 2-story structure in the center of the village, was dark. No guards, no vehicles. The entire village felt inert, abandoned. There were no dogs barking, no cooking fires, not even the faintest glow of a lantern. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept up his spine. He swept his scope along the opposite ridge, the position where he would have placed his own counter-sniper. A flicker of movement. A faint, unnatural glint. It was the reflection of starlight off coated glass. A sniper scope. Then he saw another. He panned down his eyes, now searching for other signs, the subtle tells of a prepared position. He found them everywhere. Disturbed earth along the main road into the village, a hallmark of buried IEDs. The dark geometric shape of an RPG team tucked into the window of a supposedly empty house. Men, dozens of them, slipping like wraiths into fighting positions along the rooftops. The blood drained from his face. The informant was a fake. The signal intercept was a spoof. This wasn't a meeting. It was an execution ground. They hadn't been sent to find the ghost. They had been sent to die, to be the bait that would draw their guardian angel from the sky. He keyed his radio, his voice a low, urgent hiss. Valkyrie, all Nomad elements, this is Nomad 1. Abort, I repeat, the mission is a bust. The intel is bad. This whole valley is a trap. We are walking into a... His words were cut short by the fiery contrail of an RPG erupting from a building below, exploding against the rocks just feet from his position. The night detonated. From every direction, the silent village opened up with a storm of heavy machine gun and rifle fire, a web of tracers converging on their exposed position. The trap had been sprung. The world exploded in fire and sound. From Eva's vantage point in the sky, the sleeping village of Kala Isar transformed into a pulsating hornet's nest. Dozens of muzzle flashes bloomed from the dark windows and rooftops, a coordinated storm of fire directed at the single exposed ridge where Nomad team was trapped. The ambush was overwhelming, a tidal wave of violence designed to annihilate. Nomad 1, talk to me. Eva commanded, her voice sharp, as she wrenched the Warthog into a steep dive, her systems automatically trying to lock onto the sources of the gunfire. Lars, report your status. The only answer was the hiss of an open channel now filled with the deafening roar of the firefight, being picked up by Lars's still-keyed microphone. Then a sickening crackle, a burst of static and silence. The connection was dead. She Nomad 1, do you read? She repeated, a cold dread seeping into her veins. Nomad, this is Valkyrie radio, check over. Nothing. She was flying blind. Below her was a maelstrom, a swirling chaos of friendly and enemy positions, and she had lost her eyes on the ground. To fire now would be an act of sheer recklessness. The odds of hitting Lars's team in the confusion were terrifyingly high. She was a guardian rendered powerless, forced to circle the battlefield like a vulture watching as the men she was sworn to protect were systematically torn apart. On the ridge, the initial RPG blast had thrown Lars against a rock outcropping. His head rang, his vision swam. Shrapnel had shredded their long-range radio pack, which now lay sparking and useless on the ground. Corporal Hansen, their communications specialist, was slumped beside it, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder. "Get a perimeter!" Lars roared over the din, his voice raw. "Return fire, suppress the rooftops." His men, consummate professionals even in the face of death, responded instantly, their rifles adding to the cacophony. But they were desperately outnumbered. For every burst they fired, they received 100 in return. Tracers ricocheted off the rocks around them, chipping away at their meager cover. They were completely surrounded, caught in a 360-degree crossfire. It was a perfect trap, and they were the bait. Eva watched in horror through her targeting pod. She could see the enemy fighters moving with disciplined precision, flanking Nomad's position, closing the net. She saw one of the tiny green heat signatures of a friendly soldier. A man with a name, a family, a life suddenly flare, white-hot as a grenade landed in his position, and then vanish. Another man down. The feeling of utter helplessness was a physical sickness in her stomach. Lars crawled through the dirt and rock to Hansen, dragging him further behind cover. The main radio was a write-off. Their only chance was the personal short-range radio on Hansen's vest. Lars tore it free. The casing was cracked, the antenna bent at an awkward angle. He thumbed the power switch, praying. A faint green light flickered on. He pressed the transmit button, shielding the radio with his body, as if to protect the fragile signal. "Valkyrie, this is Nomad 1, can you hear me? Valkyrie, do you read me? We are..." The signal died as he shifted position. In the cockpit, Eva caught it. A sliver of a voice buried under layers of static. "Valkyrie, read." Her heart leapt. "Nomad. I hear you. You're unreadable, say again." She threw the Warthog into a tight, dangerous bank, trying to align her antenna with the source of the faint signal. The ground rushed up at her. "Radio is out." Lars's voice cut through again, still faint but clearer. "Hansen and Petrova are hit. We are completely pinned. They're massing for an assault on our eastern flank. We can't hold them." The transmission was a desperate, fragmented plea. They were isolated, wounded, and about to be overrun. The fragile link of the damaged radio was the only thing standing between Nomad team and annihilation. For Eva, the weight of their survival settled upon her with crushing finality. She was no longer just their overwatch. She was their only hope. The broken, desperate words from Lars's radio were a call to action. Eva's mind raced, processing the fragmented intelligence. 2 men down, pinned, assault on the eastern flank. She pushed the Warthog into a tight, punishing turn, her eyes scanning the infrared landscape of the ridge, trying to visually pinpoint the enemy's flanking maneuver. She needed a target, a place to put the Warthog's fury where it would help, not harm. "Nomad. I'm rolling in on your east," she transmitted, hoping the signal would reach him. "Mark the primary threat, I need a target." Her plea was answered only by a fresh wave of static and the distant muffled sound of an explosion from the ground. Time was running out. Then a new voice cut through the channel, overriding the chaos. It was Major Davies from the Toxie, and his tone was not that of a man trying to manage a rescue. It was the voice of a cold strategist cutting his losses. "Valkyrie, this is Broadsword Command." Davies said, his voice sharp and clinical. "The situation is untenable. We are designating the Nomad asset as compromised." Eva reacted with visceral disbelief. "Negative, Broadsword, I have contact." She shot back, banking the A-10 hard. "They are still in the fight. I can provide support." "But that is a negative, Captain." Davies replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your assessment is clouded. That team is lost. We, however, have been presented with a unique opportunity. The enemy has concentrated his elite forces in a single location. It is highly probable the Ghost himself is commanding this operation from within the village. We cannot allow this opportunity to slip away." A sickening dread washed over Eva as she began to understand his logic. He was no longer thinking about the 6 men on the ridge. He was looking at the entire village as a single high-value target. "Valkyrie." Davies continued, his voice dropping into the formal cadence of an official command. "Stand by for new tasking." A data packet arrived, flashing on her tactical display. It wasn't a specific building or enemy position. It was a large red square drawn around the entire village of Kala Isar, a box that encompassed the enemy, the civilians who were surely hiding in their homes, and the rocky ridge where the surviving members of Nomad team were making their last stand. "Your new orders are as follows." Davies stated, each word a hammer blow. "You are to expend all remaining munitions, I repeat, all munitions, on the target grid. Your mission is to sanitize the objective. Level it." The air in the cockpit suddenly felt thin, impossible to breathe. Eva stared at the red box on her screen. He was ordering her to carpet bomb the entire area. He was ordering her to kill Lars and his men. In his cold, brutal arithmetic, the sacrifice of a few friendly soldiers was an acceptable price for the chance to eliminate the Ghost and his entire command structure. It was a trade he was willing to make with her hands. This was the culmination of every disagreement, every clashing philosophy. He was ordering her to become the very thing she fought against, an indiscriminate instrument of destruction. This was not a danger-close mission. This was a direct, lawful command to commit an act she knew to be a monstrous betrayal. "Chapter Broadsword." She began, her own voice sounding alien to her. "Confirm your last transmission. You are ordering me to fire on a friendly position." "I am ordering you to destroy the enemy, Captain." Davies corrected her, his voice like ice. "Nomad team is a casualty of war. Your duty is to the strategic objective. Acknowledge the order, Valkyrie." The command hung in the silent cockpit, heavier than any physical weight. Her gaze flickered between the damning red square on her display and the faint, fluctuating signal strength from Lars's broken radio. That tiny, fragile signal was proof of life. It was a heartbeat in the darkness, and she was being ordered to extinguish it. "Valkyrie, I will not repeat myself again." Davies' voice warned dangerously low. "Acknowledge the order." She was at the final crossroads. To obey was to become a killer of her own comrades. To disobey was to end her career, to face a court-martial, to become a pariah. Her entire life, her training, her oath, it had all led to this single impossible choice, suspended in the night sky between a lawful order and a human life. The order hung in the air, a demand for a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical violation. "Acknowledge the order, Valkyrie." Major Davies's voice was a blade of ice. Eva stared at the cold geometry of the red kill box on her screen. Inside it, a tiny, flickering icon represented the faint signal from Lars Jensen's radio. A heartbeat. Davies was ordering her to stop it. In that moment of absolute terrible clarity, the choice was not between obedience and insubordination. It was between her uniform and her soul. Her fingers moved across the console with a speed and certainty that felt guided by a force outside herself. She keyed the microphone for the command channel one last time. Her voice was not angry, not pleading, but unnervingly calm. "In negative broadsword," she said. "I will not comply." Before Davies could utter the furious response she knew was coming, she switched her primary radio frequency to the internal squadron channel, severing her link to the Tau C. She was alone now, a rogue element operating in defiance of the entire command structure. Her only connection to the world was the fragile, static-laced channel to the men on the ground. She had to have faith they could hear her. "Nomad, this is Valkyrie." She broadcast on the short-range frequency, her voice urgent, powerful. "If you can hear me, listen. I am making a hole. Egress south, repeat south, to the dry riverbed. I will clear the way. Move now." She didn't wait for an acknowledgement. Faith would have to be enough. She pushed the Warthog's nose down, not into a high-altitude bombing run, but into a suicidal descent. She plunged into the valley itself, dropping below the level of the surrounding ridges. The tactical map became irrelevant. This was now warfare by sight, sound, and instinct. The ground screamed past her canopy just a few hundred feet below. Instantly, the entire valley erupted, but now the fire was directed at her. Red and green tracer rounds zipped past the cockpit, a storm of angry hornets. The dull thud of heavy machine gun rounds, striking the A-10's legendary titanium bathtub armor, echoed through the airframe. The plane shuddered, alarms blared, but she held her course. She was no longer a distant god in the heavens. She had descended into hell to walk among the flames. Her eyes, honed by 1,000 hours of training, scanned the terrain, identifying the greatest threats to the southern escape route. An RPG team in a window, a dug-in machine gun nest, a mortar pit behind a low wall. Her thumb found the trigger. The first gun run was a terrifying act of focused rage. The GAU-8 Avenger spoke its deafening sermon, "BRRRRRT," and the RPG team vanished in a cloud of dust and fire. She pulled the Warthog up in a gut-wrenching climb, rolled it over, and dived again. Another short, precise burst, and the machine gun nest was silenced. On the ground, deafened and bleeding, Lars heard her broken transmission. He saw the impossible, the A-10, the Angel, flying below them, drawing the fire of the entire enemy force onto itself. It was a sight of such raw, terrible courage that it shocked his men out of their death spiral. It was a chance. "You heard her," Lars yelled, grabbing his wounded radio man and hauling him to his feet. "Move south, lay down, covering fire." Galvanized into action, the remaining soldiers of Nomad team began a fighting withdrawal, firing and moving, falling back from the ridge towards the salvation of the Wadi. Eva saw them, 4 tiny heat signatures moving through the chaos. The enemy saw them too, and began to shift forces to cut them off at the mouth of the riverbed. She had one pass left before her fuel state became critical. She lined the Warthog up with the Wadi flying straight down the gut of the canyon, so low she could see the individual faces of the enemy fighters as they turned their rifles to the sky. She held the trigger down for 3 full seconds. The cannon's roar was continuous, apocalyptic. It carved a line of utter devastation, a path of fire and metal that tore through the enemy's blocking position. Then, with her cannon smoking and her warning lights screaming, she pulled back on the stick with all her strength, clawing her way out of the valley's deadly embrace. As she cleared the ridge, she banked and looked back. Below in the darkness, she saw them. 4 figures scrambling out of the wadi and disappearing into the concealing folds of the mountains beyond. They were through. They were alive. The radio was silent. The battle for Kala Isar was over. But as she turned her battered aircraft towards home, Eva knew that her own private war had just begun. The flight back to base was a long, lonely journey through a silent sky. The Warthog, a marvel of durability, protested every mile. Hydraulic pressure warnings blinked insistently, the controls felt sluggish, and a spiderweb of cracks had appeared on the inner layer of her canopy from a round that had come too close. The physical state of her aircraft was a perfect mirror for her own battered running on fumes, but somehow still flying. As she lowered her landing gear, she saw them. Not the usual flurry of activity from the ground crew, but two stark white vehicles of the security police, their lights off, waiting grimly on the tarmac. Beside them stood Major Davies, his arms crossed his face, an unreadable mask of stone. The moment the wheels touched down, her fate was sealed. She taxied the wounded bird to her designated hardstand and began the shutdown sequence. When the engines finally spooled down, the silence that enveloped the cockpit was absolute. She opened the canopy, and the dry, hot air of the desert hit her. The war was over. Her war had just begun. She hadn't even unstrapped from her seat when Davies and two armed MPs arrived at the top of the boarding ladder. "Shut Captain Eva Rostova." The senior MP said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "By the authority of Colonel Matthews, you are hereby relieved of your flight duties. You are to surrender your sidearm and come with us. You are under investigation for willful disobedience of a direct order during combat operations." Eva didn't speak. She slowly unholstered her pistol, handing it over butt first. The act was a public and profound humiliation. As they escorted her down the ladder, she saw the faces of her ground crew watching from a distance, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and for a few, a quiet, helpless sympathy. The next 48 hours were a blur of sterile, windowless rooms. She was formally charged, assigned a weary but competent legal officer from the JAG Corps, and confined to her quarters. Her future, once a limitless sky, had shrunk to the four walls of a potential prison cell. The preliminary hearing was held in a makeshift courtroom on the base. Eva sat ramrod straight in her dress uniform, stripped of her wings and squadron patches. On the other side of the room, Major Davies presented the prosecution's case with cold, unassailable logic. He played the audio logs of his direct lawful command. He played the recordings of her clear, unequivocal refusal. He showed the data from her flight path proving she had acted on her own accord. The evidence was overwhelming, the facts of the case indisputable. Captain Rostova had gone rogue. When it was her turn, Eva spoke calmly. She didn't offer excuses. She explained her rationale that she had re-established a tenuous communication link, that she had assessed the friendly forces to be alive and combat effective, and that the order to sanitize the grid constituted an unlawful order to murder her comrades. "My primary duty in a close air support role," she concluded, her voice steady, "is the preservation of the lives of the soldiers on the ground. I upheld that duty." The prosecuting officer scoffed. "A duty that exists only in your own mind, Captain, above your sworn oath to obey the chain of command." The case seemed open and shut. The three officers presiding over the hearing looked grim. Then Eva's legal officer called his first witness. The door at the back of the room opened. Sergeant Lars Jensen walked in his arm in a sling, his face bruised and stitched, but his eyes clear and resolute. Behind him came the other three survivors of Nomad Team 1, leaning heavily on a crutch. They moved to the front of the room and sat in the front row, a silent, unified phalanx of support. Lars took the stand. He recounted the events of the ambush with the same calm precision he used on the radio. He described the moment their comms were destroyed, the mounting casualties, the certainty of their own deaths. "And we were overrun." Lars set his gaze fixed on the presiding officers. but his words aimed at the whole room. We were dead. Then through a cracked radio I heard a voice. It was Valkyrie. She said she was opening a path. He paused, his eyes sweeping over to Davies, then back. We didn't see an act of insubordination. We saw a miracle. We saw an A-10 fly into a valley of death, deliberately drawing the fire of an entire enemy force so that we might live. That aircraft absorbed a storm of lead that should have torn it from the sky. He leaned forward slightly. Major Davies's order, had it been followed, would have been my death sentence, and the death sentence of my men. Captain Rostova's actions are the sole reason 4 soldiers are sitting in this room today, able to testify. She did not disobey an order to abandon us. She upheld a higher one to bring us home. A heavy silence filled the room. The narrative of a rogue, emotional pilot had been shattered, replaced by the unflinching testimony of the men she had saved. Eva looked at Lars, and for the first time in days, she felt the crushing weight on her chest begin to lift. She was not alone. Lars Jensen's testimony had changed the fundamental equation of the hearing. It was no longer a simple matter of a pilot disobeying an order. It was now the story of a commander willing to sacrifice his own men versus a pilot willing to sacrifice her career to save them. The military justice system, designed for black and white clarity, was forced to confront an impossible shade of gray. The verdict came 3 days later, not in the cold formality of the courtroom, but in the quiet wood-paneled office of the base commander, Colonel Matthews. Eva stood at attention before his desk, the morning sun casting long shadows across the room. The colonel, a man whose face was a roadmap of long years at war, looked at her not with anger, but with a profound weariness. Captain Rostova. He began, his voice low. The facts of this case are not in dispute. You received a lawful order from your direct superior in a combat situation, and you willfully and deliberately disobeyed that order. In 99 out of 100 cases, that would be the end of your career and the beginning of a long stay in a military prison. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished desk. It was an official letter of reprimand. This will be placed in your permanent service record. It states for posterity that you failed in your duty to obey the chain of command. It will likely prevent any future promotion. You will carry this mark for the rest of your career, however long that may be. Eva's heart sank, even though she had expected nothing less. However, the colonel continued, leaning back in his chair. The testimony of Sergeant Jensen and the men of Nomad team has presented this command with extraordinary mitigating circumstances. 4 soldiers are alive today because of the choice you made. He paused, his gaze intense. The official investigation is closed. All charges against you are dropped. You are reinstated to full flight status, effective immediately. He let the words hang in the air. Major Davies has been reassigned to a staff position at CENTCOM. He will not be serving in a combat command role again. Off the record, Captain, a piece of paper in your file is a hell of a lot better than 4 more names on the memorial wall. You did the right thing. Now get out of my office and we will never speak of this again. Eva took the letter, the paper feeling both impossibly heavy and utterly meaningless. She rendered a salute, turned, and walked out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. She was free. She was a pilot again. As she walked towards the flight line, the familiar roar of jet engines, a welcome symphony, she saw a figure leaning against the fuselage of her newly repaired A-10. The ground crew had worked miracles, patching the dozens of bullet holes, replacing entire sections of the wing. The jet, like her, now bore visible scars. The figure was Lars Jensen, dressed in full combat gear, his rifle slung over his good shoulder. He watched her approach, a quiet understanding in his eyes. He gestured with his chin towards the letter in her hand. Heard the news? He said, his voice a low rumble. That piece of paper in my book, that's a medal. I was just doing my job, Sergeant. Eva replied the words, feeling inadequate. No. Lars corrected her softly. You did more than that. You reminded us what the job is supposed to be about. He gave her a small, brief nod that was more eloquent than 1,000 words of thanks. Stay safe up there, Valkyrie. He turned and walked away to join his team, who were waiting to board a helicopter for their next mission. Eva stood for a long moment, watching them go. Then she climbed the ladder and settled into the familiar embrace of the cockpit. It felt like coming home. Her fingers moved with practiced grace over the controls, the pre-flight check, a comforting litany. The reprimand was tucked into a pocket of her flight suit, a permanent reminder not of her failure, but of her choice. As the Warthog's engines spooled to life, she was no longer the same pilot who had left this runway days ago. The doubt, the fear, the desperate need for approval, they had all been burned away in the fires of Kala Isar. In their place was a quiet, unshakable certainty. The tower cleared her for takeoff. She pushed the throttles forward, and the wounded, scarred Warthog surged down the runway and leaped into the sky. Climbing into the vast blue emptiness, she banked the aircraft and looked down. The brown, unforgiving earth was no longer an abstract tactical map. It was a living place full of people whose names she would never know, but whose lives were inextricably linked to hers. Somewhere down there, Nomad team was moving through the shadows. Somewhere else, the families of Warhorse Platoon were mourning their dead. She was their guardian. Not a call sign bestowed upon her, but a title she had earned in smoke and fire, a vow she had sealed with an act of defiance. And for the first time, looking down at the world from her lonely perch, she felt not the weight of the burden, but the profound, solemn peace of her purpose. Years passed. The dust of Zargos eventually settled, though the scars on its landscape and on the souls of those who fought there remained. Captain Eva Rostova, Valkyrie, never received another promotion. The letter of reprimand, a silent official admonishment, ensured that. Yet her reputation, whispered from comms to mess halls, grew into something far more substantial than rank. She became a legend among the ground pounders, the kind of pilot whose name brought a sigh of relief when it crackled over the radio. Her Warthog, a collection of patched aluminum and titanium, was a testament to her philosophy. It was a canvas of battle damage, repaired a visible record of every time she had plunged into the fire to shield others. She continued to fly her presence, a steady, unwavering beacon in a volatile world. The younger pilots in her squadron, those who had never known Major Davies's rigid command, looked at her with a mix of awe and quiet respect. They saw not a reprimanded officer, but the pilot who always came back and always brought her charges home. Major Davies, meanwhile, faded into the anonymous bureaucracy of staff work. His career, marked by ambition and a ruthless adherence to protocol, stalled in the quiet corridors of power, far from the messy realities of the battlefield. The strategic victories he pursued were often hollow, devoid of the human cost he never quite understood. Sergeant Lars Jensen, having fully recovered from his wounds, continued his work in the shadows, his voice still that steady, calm anchor for those above him. He never forgot the roar of the Warthog descending into the canyon, the impossible act of courage that had given him a second life. Occasionally, their paths would cross. A brief professional radio check, a nod across a crowded mess hall. No words were needed. The trust forged in fire was a bond beyond language, a shared history that ran deeper than any military protocol. Eva never saw the ghost again, though his influence, like a persistent shadow, lingered in the intelligence briefs. But she knew that in Kala Isar, in that valley of death, she had chosen not to become his instrument. She had chosen life. Sometimes in the quiet of a sunrise sortie, as the desert awoke in shades of rose and gold, Eva would look down at the vast, sprawling land beneath her wings. She would think of the faces real and imagined of the soldiers who walked its unforgiving terrain. She understood then that the Warthog's guardian was not just a title but a living, breathing promise. It was the weight of every life she protected and the unwavering conviction that some lines, no matter the cost, must never be crossed. The screens of her cockpit, glowing with data and possibility, reflected the first light of dawn. The engines hummed a familiar song of purpose. She was not a hero. She was a guardian. And the sky, vast and endless, stretched out before her waiting.